From the very beginning, life on Earth has never been gentle. Long before cities rose, before empires fell, before the wheel turned or the fire cracked within a hearth, there were people, not people as we are now, but the very first. They walked the earth without history behind them, and with no certainty ahead. These earliest humans didn't have maps, books, or spoken legends to guide their days. They only had instinct, observation, and the long, slow lessons of trial and error, passed down from mother to child, from silence to action. They knew no calendars, no comfort, and certainly no pause from the overwhelming challenge of survival. This story is about them, the first humans, their impossible struggle. A struggle so vast, so quietly epic, and so utterly exhausting that it invites you now to listen, to settle in, and to imagine not the glamour of prehistory, but the day-to-day hardships that defined a life no one today would survive for long. In this quiet journey, we will not raise our voices, nor will we leap through time in dramatic bursts. Instead, we'll walk slowly across millennia, across forests and deserts, across rivers and ridges, beside creatures long gone and dangers ever present. There will be no victory to celebrate, no villain to defeat, and no rescue at the end. Just a gentle, truthful unfolding of the hardest existence imaginable, being among the first of our kind. Please stay with us until the end of this story. And if you're still awake, share in the comments how you feel. Are you surprised, relaxed, thoughtful, or perhaps just tired in the best way? Your presence matters in this quiet corner of history, and now, let us begin. The world of early humans was not a world we would recognize, not in structure, and not in comfort. The sun still rose, and the moon still glowed, but the rhythms of daily life did not begin with the buzz of alarms, or the switch of lights. They began with hunger, not the passing kind, but the persistent gnawing hunger of uncertain. Food to be an early human was to wake each day, not knowing if that day would end in fullness or starvation. The stomach was a compass, pointing always toward the next possible bite. In the early phases, around 2.5 million years ago, the hominin lineage, the ancestors of modern humans, was just beginning to shape stone tools. These tools were not grand creations, but flakes and edges chipped from stone cores. Their usefulness was hard-won. A single shard might help scrape the skin from a scavenged carcass, or dig out edible roots from the parched earth. There were no houses, no shelters, but what nature provided. Caves, hollow trees, thick reeds, and overhanging rocks offered brief relief from the elements. Fire, when it finally came, was not controlled at first. Lightning could ignite brush, and with cautious hands, a few clever ancestors learned to keep the embers alive. It would take hundreds of thousands of years before fire could be made at will. Until then, its warmth, its light, and its protection were a rare and precious gift. Early humans did not speak as we do. They had gestures, facial expressions, and perhaps a few simple sounds. Communication was essential, but language, as we know, it was still being shaped in the mouths of our ancestors. Without spoken stories, memory lived in action. A child learned not from lectures, but from watching closely, watching where an elder stepped, what they picked, how they moved silently toward prey, or retreated from danger. Silence was survival. The animals they lived among were not the small, domesticated creatures we know. Saber-toothed cats, giant hyenas, dire wolves, and towering elephant-like mammals known as mammoths roamed the same lands. These creatures were not villains, they were fellow survivors, often more powerful and better adapted to the terrain. For humans, the strategy was rarely confrontation. It was caution, observation, and learning how to avoid becoming a meal. Clothing was not made, but found skins of animals, perhaps, but not always worn in the way we imagine. To keep warm meant staying in groups, huddled and cold, or finding sunlit rocks to lie against. Seasons were not marked by calendars, but by the feel of the air, the migration of herds, or the blooming and dying of plants. Each day was a slow trial: where to go, what to eat, who had died, and who remained. Infants were fragile, and many did not survive. Mothers grieved, though we cannot know the full shape of their sorrow. Fathers and uncles hunted when they could, but often it was scavenging that fed the group. picking apart what predators left behind, or tracking weak, limping animals to take what was needed. Food meant life, and food was never guaranteed. And then there was the environment. The Ice Age was a constant backdrop. Glaciers crept and retreated. Entire ecosystems shifted. What was forest might become open steppe, and what was fruitful might turn barren in the space of a few years. Mobility was survival. To stay in one place for too long meant starvation or exposure. Small groups moved with the seasons, across miles and miles, wearing out their feet, navigating by the stars or the shape of distant hills. Rest was rare, and when they slept, they did so lightly. Predators did not care for the vulnerability of dreams. Still, there were moments of connection, a shared piece of meat, a warm touch, the watchful eye of a sibling over a younger child. These small human moments are what carried them forward, generation by generation. Evolution did not choose the strongest or the fastest alone. It favored those who cared, who noticed, who adapted with patience and intelligence. It favored those who paid attention. And so, the first humans, or perhaps we should say, the first to be called human, endured. They did not thrive in the way we understand it. They survived in the way that only the most resilient organisms ever have. Through hardship, loss, bitter cold, constant fear, and endless uncertainty, they kept going. One breath, one step, one fire kept burning a little longer. They shaped the long, slow dawn of humanity, not with great inventions or epic victories, but with steady endurance. It was not glorious, but it was enough. And it would eventually be the beginning of everything that came after. We will continue, step by step, through this journey of ancient survival in the parts that follow. Each moment we uncover brings us closer to understanding, not how great early humans were, but how impossibly hard it was to simply live one more day, and how they did it anyway. The passing of time in the ancient world was not felt in minutes or hours, but in the slow rhythm of breath and season, of hunger and the way shadows moved across the earth. The early humans did not think of time as we do, and yet they lived entirely within its demands. Every action, every decision, every quiet moment of rest or movement was part of a constant negotiation with the world around them. And though they had no word for time, they knew the feel of urgency, of opportunity slipping away with daylight, of warmth fading with the turn of the sun. They rose early, though not by choice. Sleep was never a guarantee. The night belonged to other creatures who saw better in the dark, who heard every rustle, who crept and stalked with purposes that made rest dangerous. For early humans, sleep came in pieces. Short, shallow moments of vulnerability, often in turns, rarely together. One or two remained alert, while others closed their eyes. The ability to sleep well was a luxury of safety, and safety was a distant dream. They ate what they could, fruit when it was available, though seasons determined which kinds and for how long. Berries were gathered with careful trial. Some were harmless, others made the stomach twist or worse. Knowledge was built over generations, not with writing or formal learning, but by memory and example. A mother showing her child which leaves to avoid, a group remembering the place where roots grew thick near the river bend. But rivers also drew other animals. Drinking there could mean a sudden encounter, a chase, or death. So even water, essential and abundant, carried danger. In times of luck, an animal might be brought down. Not a lion or a mammoth, those were usually too large and dangerous, but perhaps a smaller creature, a wild boar, a hare, a bird caught in a snare made of plant fiber and patience. Cooking was not always an option. If fire was not at hand, the meat was eaten raw, torn with teeth, not unlike our own, but stronger through need. Bones were cracked open for marrow. Nothing was wasted. Fat, though rare, was prized. It gave energy, helped withstand cold. Every part of the animal was used: skin for wrapping, bone for scraping, sinew for binding. Tools were not beautiful. They were shaped by repetition and urgency, not by art. Cold was a greater enemy than most creatures. Even in places near the equator, the nights could chill the body to the bone. The human form, though upright and clever, was not made for the cold. No fur, no built-in insulation, only fire, if it could be maintained. or pressed bodies, and whatever coverings nature allowed. Wetness was worse. Rain, mist, sudden storms, any could turn a night from survivable to fatal. Shelter had to be found. A crevice in the rock, a tree hollow, a pile of leaves. They were not homes. They were temporary respites from the eternal exposure of the outside world. The children, fragile, often silent, grew with wide eyes. They watched, always watched. A misstep could mean poison, a fall, or being left behind. But the group did not move fast. The elderly, though few, were not abandoned outright. Even those with weakened limbs carried memory. They knew the signs of weather, the trails of game, the calls of birds that meant danger. Knowledge was a precious resource, held in the minds of those who had survived the most. Their groups were small, perhaps a dozen, maybe two. More than that was hard to feed, hard to move, hard to keep quiet when quiet was needed. Strangers were rare, but not unknown. Sometimes, they would be seen at a distance, other humans, other families. The reactions varied. Some encounters led to trade or shared food, others ended in death. There was no law, only instinct, only the fragile thread of cooperation or the sharpened edge of fear. They had no mirrors, yet they knew themselves, not in reflection, but in feeling. A cut on the hand, the pressure of the ground beneath their feet, the tight pull of muscle after a long chase. Injuries were common. Twisted ankles, broken fingers, cracked teeth. There were no healers, only time, rest, or the slow slide into infection. A wound that could be ignored one day might become a death sentence the next. And yet, they endured. The sun rose, they moved with it. A day's walk might lead to a patch of edible roots, or to nothing at all. Hunger followed them like a quiet shadow. The body adapted, but not endlessly. Fat disappeared first, then muscle. The eyes became hollow. In bad seasons, the youngest died first. Silence followed. Mourning had no rituals yet. Perhaps a mother would carry the lifeless form a little longer, not yet ready to let go. Perhaps not. The living had to live, and still, there was thought, the beginnings of wonder. A child drawing in the dust with a stick, someone arranging stones without a reason. A fascination with fire, not just its warmth, but its movement, its sound. These were the quiet seeds of something deeper. Not yet art, not yet belief, but the first flickers of a mind reaching beyond survival. The wind blew constantly, and with it came scents: animal musk, blooming plants, distant rot. The nose was an essential guide. Smell told them where to go, when to pause, what to avoid. Ears strained in the dark. Every crack of a twig could mean a stalking predator. Every shift in the leaves might be prey or foe. The eyes scanned constantly, sky, ground, branches, shadows. Living meant watching. Watching meant staying alive. And as each day slipped into the next, they moved onward. There was no end in sight, no destination, only the rhythm of survival. One more day, one more step, one more chance to find food, to escape harm, to keep the fire burning. If they were lucky enough to have one. The impossible struggle continued, not in great leaps, but in the small, tired moments between waking and sleeping. It was not a story of triumph, but of persistence. And so they endured, quietly, slowly, without applause, without witness. And in doing so, they carried us forward toward everything that would follow. The land stretched endlessly, and the early humans wandered across it with no map, no path, and no sense that the place they stood today would be any different from the place they would find tomorrow. The earth did not welcome them, it simply existed. Trees grew or died, rivers ran high or dry, animals came and went, and the weather changed with no regard for the lives beneath the sky. To survive here required not only strength or cleverness, but also an acceptance of uncertainty. A willingness to keep moving even when no sign pointed the way. Movement was the only constant. When the animals moved, so did they. When the rains fell or the heat rose, they adjusted. They learned the patterns slowly, over generations, by observing and remembering. The migration of birds might mean a shift in season. The sudden blooming of a certain flower might hint that fruits were ripening. Elsewhere, they learned not by explanation, but by repetition. a mother pointing to a plant and shaking her head, a child seeing someone fall ill after eating the wrong thing. Life was a long, quiet education. Their bodies were not built for comfort. They were built to endure. Feet calloused over time from walking on rock and sand. Hands grew strong and scarred from climbing, digging, pulling. Backs bent beneath the weight of gathered wood, of carried children, of bundles of grass for bedding or cover. Illness was constant. Parasites lived in their guts. Bacteria entered through cuts. Fevers came and went. Sometimes people recovered. Often they did not. They aged quickly. A human who lived to 30 was already old. Gray hair came early, if it came at all. Teeth wore down with grit from unwashed. Roots and grains. Vision faded. Hearing dulled. There were no remedies, only adaptation. A grandmother who could no longer walk far might still tend the fire. A man too weak to hunt might teach a child how to watch the sky. Even the weak, if not in pain, found small ways to contribute. There was no written language, and no permanent memory. But still, they had stories, not in words, but in repetition. A child learned how to crack a bone for marrow by copying an elder. A young hunter mimicked the stance of someone more experienced. Stories lived in action, in gesture. There were no myths yet, but there were patterns, some based in truth, others in coincidence. If lightning struck a tree after a certain animal appeared, perhaps the two were linked. If a person vanished after swimming in a certain river, that river became taboo. These were the first whispers of belief. Not religion, not yet, but an instinct that there was meaning in the chaos. Sleep came when it could. In warm places they lay in the open, under the stars, heads resting on arms, with someone always keeping watch. In colder regions they huddled, in groups, backs pressed together for warmth. The fire helped when they had it, but maintaining fire was difficult. It required dry wood, attention, and a constant eye. If it went out, starting it again was a slow and uncertain task. Some groups learned to carry embers wrapped in bark or moss, preserving the heat through the night. These were not just practical acts, they were moments of quiet genius. Tiny innovations that changed the shape of survival. Fire changed more than warmth, it changed food. Cooked meat was easier to chew, easier to digest. It killed some of the parasites that raw flesh carried. It made roots and grains edible that were otherwise toxic. And in its glow, there was light, a kind of safety, a flickering border against the unknown. Night became less absolute, but fire also brought risk. The smoke could reveal their location to animals or other humans. The flames could escape control, setting dry grass ablaze. It was a gift, but also a burden. Like all tools of survival, it came with a cost. Language remained simple, but over time, sounds became more varied. A specific grunt for danger, a different one for food. Over thousands of years, these sounds began to combine. Meaning grew from repetition. Children picked up the habits of their elders, and slowly, without knowing it, the first threads of language were woven. But even then, it was not language as we know it. There were no sentences, only signals, warnings, requests. Enough to keep alive, enough to keep moving. Tools remained simple. Stones chipped into sharp edges. Spears hardened in fire. Over generations they learned to attach stone points to sticks, with strips of hide or natural glue made from tree resin. Each improvement was slow, often discovered independently by different groups. There was no race for progress, just necessity. A sharper tool meant a cleaner cut. A better spear meant a better chance at bringing down prey. Every advancement was tied directly to the demands of life. The earth was not quiet, even far from danger. The sounds of nature were constant. The rustling of grass, the chatter of birds, the sudden crack of a branch. Early humans learned to listen. They learned to notice what was missing as much as what was present. If birds stopped singing, something larger might be approaching. If the wind shifted, it might carry a new scent prey or predator. They were not merely surviving, they were learning. Slowly, carefully, they lived close to death. But they also lived close to life. A child's first steps brought smiles. Even if briefly, the sharing of food created bonds. A soft hum before sleep might calm a frightened toddler. These small gestures, these human moments, helped them endure. Even in the hardest conditions, something in them wanted to care, to connect. That desire would someday shape civilizations. But in the beginning, it simply meant not being alone. So they moved, they adapted, they remembered. And every small step forward, every improved tool, every useful sound, every fire kept alive through rain carried the species one breath closer to the future. They were not yet us, but they were becoming, not through triumph, not through comfort, but through persistence. The path ahead was never clear. There were no roads, no borders, no names for the places they passed through. Forests opened into grasslands, which led to rocky hills, which faded into marshes or deserts. The land changed constantly, and so did their choices. They didn't always know where food would be. Sometimes they followed the same trails, returning to old places by instinct or memory. But just as often, they wandered, drawn by smoke in the distance, or birds circling in the sky, or the faint tracks of animals that had passed during the night. Each step forward was a question. Each direction carried both risk and hope. The children walked when they could. When they were too small or too tired, they were carried, not in strollers or slings, but with arms that had already carried firewood and animal skins and water from streams miles away. The pace was slow, always slow. No one was left behind quickly, but no one was waited for too long either. Life required balance, and when a member of the group could no longer move forward, an elder too sick to stand, a child too weak to open their eyes, there were choices to be made, hard ones. Some waited, some grieved, some simply moved on, quietly, because survival left little room for long farewells. Rain was both a gift and a threat. It brought water, helped new plants grow, made the air cool. But too much could flood their shelters, wash away trails, or soak the kindling they needed to keep the fire alive. Wet clothes clung to their skin. Wet soil turned to sucking mud. Movement slowed. Sometimes they stayed put for days, huddled under trees or overhangs, waiting for the skies to clear. There were no tasks to pass the time, only the sound of falling water, the press of damp earth beneath them, and the constant awareness that hunger did not stop just because the rain had begun. When the skies cleared, they would emerge slowly, blinking into the light. They would stretch stiff legs and shake off leaves and insects. The fire, if it had survived, would be coaxed back to life. If not, they would start again, flint against stone, wood against wood, sparks, smoke, the patience of repetition. It was not always successful. Some days ended without fire, and without fire, the night was long. They were not alone in the world. Other creatures lived and hunted beside them. Lions, wolves, giant snakes, hyenas, and more. Some they learned to avoid, others learned to avoid them. But there were also others like themselves, other bands of humans or near humans, spread across the wide land. Sometimes they saw smoke in the distance. Sometimes they followed it, cautiously. Encounters varied. Some were peaceful, they shared food, exchanged gestures, even stayed together for a while. Other meetings ended in violence, with stolen tools, injured limbs, or silence. Trust was rare, and usually temporary. The bodies of the early humans reflected their lives. Muscles built, not from training, but from necessity. Thick bones from carrying, climbing, crouching, skin weathered by sun and wind. Their eyes were sharp from watching, and their ears tuned to small sounds. They bore scars on their arms, their faces, their backs. Each one told a story, but no one told it aloud. There were no written records, no drawings yet, only the body, remember, and the mind. For even then their thoughts were not simple. They noticed patterns. They remembered which places brought more food. They began to feel the shape of the moon cycle, though they did not name it. They saw how animals behaved before storms. They watched the way plants withered when the soil dried. These were not random observations. Over time, they formed expectations. They began to predict, to prepare. When one member of the group grew ill, others noticed. They brought water, moved more slowly, watched more carefully. They did not have medicine as we understand it, but they had instinct. They chewed certain leaves, perhaps out of habit. They placed cool stones on the forehead. They sat quietly nearby. It was care, even if it did not always heal. And when someone died, there was a moment of stillness. Sometimes the body was left where it lay. Other times it was carried, covered, or hidden from animals. It is hard to know what they thought about death, but they noticed it, and they did not ignore it. Nights without fire were the hardest. The dark was full and absolute. The stars above were cold and unreachable. The ground below was damp or hard. Every noise seemed louder in the dark. Every shape in the shadows seemed like something worse. Sleep came slowly, and often not at all. In these moments they huddled together, not only for warmth, but for reassurance. There were no stories yet to comfort them, only closeness. Food remained uncertain. Some days brought abundance. A fallen tree might reveal insects and grubs. A trapped animal might provide meat for several days. A bush bursting with fruit was a rare delight. On such days there was laughter, not loud, but present. Smiles, chewing, the quiet joy of a full belly, but even then, they ate cautiously. Food spoiled quickly. Animals could smell it. And the future was always uncertain. There was no calendar to mark time, only memories. The time when the river dried up. The season when the big animals passed through. The year the cold lasted longer than usual. These were their markers. And they were passed along not in writing, but in behavior. Don't go that way, there were wolves there once. Don't eat those leaves, they made someone sick. It was survival through remembering. And in the remembering, a kind of knowledge formed. A slow, unspoken education, one that would grow, over thousands of years, into culture, into language, into all that came after. But for now, they kept moving, one foot after the other, one day at a time, carried forward by nothing more than the will to live. Not with certainty, not with ease, but with quiet, relentless strength. They were not yet us, but they were already something more than what had come before. Time passed, though they had no clocks to measure it. The sun moved across the sky in its slow arc, and they learned to feel its rhythm not in numbers, but in shadows. The long shadow of early morning meant cool air, the need to move quickly. The high sun of midday was harsh, and they sought shade, rested, or sat quietly with their backs against the earth. When the sun lowered and the sky turned gold, the air shifted. It was time to gather close again, to find shelter, to prepare for another uncertain night. This was the rhythm of their days, simple, steady, and different to their struggles. Sometimes they found caves, not grand, deep caverns filled with mystery, but low hollows in the rock, protected from wind and rain. These spaces became brief homes. Inside, the air was still, and the ground was dry. They made small fires, stacked stones, and layered the floor with leaves and grass. For a time, they stayed in one place. The young explored nearby. The elders watched the sky, but the land never allowed rest for long. Eventually, the food grew scarce, or another group came close, or the animals moved on, and they followed. The seasons were not marked by names, but by feeling. The time when the air grew sharp and breathing left mist. The time when the rains came more often and the rivers swelled. The time when berries appeared again and birds filled the trees with noise. These changes guided them more than any map ever would. They noticed the changing coats of animals, the shifting colors of plants. The world spoke in subtle ways, and they learned to listen without needing words. Children were everywhere. Born into hardship, they grew quickly. They cried often, for warmth, for food, for comfort. And yet they were carried with care, strapped to backs with rough hide, swaddled in fur, rocked near the fire. Laughter, when it came, often started with children. A game with pebbles, a chase through the grass, the discovery of a smooth stick or a shiny stone. These were moments of light in a world filled with uncertainty. And from these early games came skill throwing, balancing, climbing, learning by doing, always. Tools became slightly more refined. The sharp stones they once held in fists were now tied to sticks, giving longer reach. They learned to scrape hides clean with bone edges, to dig into hard soil with sharpened wood. Each tool had a purpose, though none were named. A good tool was shared, then lost. then remade. Knowledge passed not through teaching, but through copying. A child watched someone twist plant fibers into a cord, then tried it themselves. Slowly, skill spread. The animals they hunted were larger than most alive today. Thick-haired beasts with curving tusks. Heavy-boned creatures that could trample a person in a heartbeat. Herds of grazing giants that moved across the land in thunderous waves. Hunting was not a daily task, and success was never guaranteed. But when the chance came, they gathered, planned, and struck with caution. Some used cliffs or bogs to trap animals, others waited in silence, using patience as their only weapon. They knew the risks. A misstep could mean death, but a successful hunt fed many. The meat was divided, not perfectly, but with some sense of fairness. Elders were given the softer parts. Children were fed early. The rest ate what they could, chewing slowly, swallowing warmth into cold bodies. Bones were cracked for marrow. Hides were scraped and dried. Sinew was pulled into thread. Nothing was wasted, because waste meant weakness, and weakness could not be afforded. In their minds, thoughts began to stretch further. They remembered not just what happened, but why. If a hunt failed, they recalled the wind. If a fire spread too quickly, they remembered the dry grass. Memory turned into reasoning, and reasoning into primitive understanding. No science yet, no explanations, but questions quiet, persistent, unanswered. And in the stillness of evening, when the fire flickered low, and the world outside was quiet, something began to form that went beyond survival. A sense of wonder, perhaps. A need to make marks in the dirt, to arrange stones in a pattern, to hum a low steady tune that soothed the mind. These small acts served no clear purpose, but they happened anyway, and slowly, almost invisibly, they gave shape to early culture. There was no ownership, only presence. A tree full of fruit was not someone's, it simply was. A hollow in a hill became home until it no longer was. They moved not by choice, but by necessity. Possessions were few, and those they carried were chosen for usefulness, not beauty. And yet, sometimes, someone picked up a stone simply because it felt smooth. Sometimes, a shell was kept long after its use had passed. These were early signs of meaning, not just need. Illness was accepted as part of life. There were no cures, only time. Some plants eased pain, some soothed the stomach. But many ailments passed through the group like silent visitors. Fever, infection, injury, none could be named, but all were felt, and yet, people cared. They sat beside the sick, they cooled foreheads, they shared what little they had, not because it promised a cure, but because something in them responded to suffering. Overhead, the stars wheeled across the sky. They did not know what they were, but they saw them. Night after night, the moon changed shape. The stars shifted position. These were facts, not yet stories, but they noticed, and perhaps in silence, they began to wonder. They were not yet builders, not yet painters, not yet farmers, but they were learners, observers, survivors. They knew the shape of a footprint, the smell of a predator, the sound of breaking branches far away. They knew how to listen to the land, and in doing so, they began to shape their place in it. It was not an age of glory. It was not an age of peace. It was simply the beginning, the long, slow beginning of the human story, written not in books, but in muscle, breath, memory, and endurance. Each day a struggle, each moment a step forward, each breath a quiet victory. They lived not easily, not safely, but they lived. In the coldest times of the year, the days shrank into brief moments of light, and the nights stretched endlessly, heavy with frost and silence. The wind carried no scent of food, and the ground gave up nothing. The early humans did not know the cause of seasons, only that the warmth left and returned again, with no promise of when. During these hard stretches, movement slowed. They traveled less. They stayed nearer to rocks or hills that shielded them from wind. Caves were most precious then, dark and dry, holding the warmth of many bodies pressed close together through long hours of stillness. In those winters, fire was not a convenience, it was the boundary between life and death. It had to be guarded. Someone was always awake, feeding it, poking it, whispering to it with cracked hands and quiet breath. If the fire went out in the night, all would wake, all would feel the danger, and starting it again was not quick or guaranteed. Even those who had learned to coax sparks from stone needed time, dry material, patience and luck, so they treasured the fire. It became the heart of the group, the thing they circled around, not just for heat, but for comfort. The cold affected everything. Fingers stiffened, legs ached, eyes watered. Hunting became a greater risk, as prey animals also struggled and became more desperate. Sometimes they followed the tracks of an animal for hours or days, across frozen streams, over dry, brittle hillsides. The chase might end in success, but more often it ended in disappointment, or injury, or simply in exhaustion. In these times, hunger became constant. Stomachs ached, jaws clenched, voices grew quiet, and yet they endured. They found food where they could, a frozen root here, a rabbit caught in a crude trap, bones from an animal long dead, still containing marrow, the tough meat of dried hides, chewed and swallowed just to keep the body going. In this struggle, even the smallest calorie mattered, and still, they moved slowly toward the future. Water remained a necessity, even in the cold. Snow and ice had to be melted. Streams were watched for signs of flow beneath the frozen surface. Sometimes, a group would move slightly, not far, just enough to find a better place to collect meltwater, or to catch the sun's warmth in midday. Their movements were dictated not by preference, but by need. Children, as always, remained both a burden and a promise. They needed warmth, food, constant care, but they also brought a strange kind of light. Their laughter, even when faint or rare, reminded the older ones of something they could not name. Perhaps hope, perhaps meaning. They were the ones who tried new things, touched the flame, tasted the bitter root, climbed the tree others thought too thin. They learned through pain, and pain became instruction passed along without words. At times, the group would gather around the fire, not to speak, but to be together. There was comfort in that closeness. No stories yet, no language beyond simple sounds, gestures, and shared looks, but still, there was connection. One person mimicked a bird call, and others joined in. A rhythm was tapped on a log, a shape was drawn in the dust with a finger. None of it lasted. None of it was meant to. But in those quiet moments, something deeper than survival began to take root. Tools grew more specialized, slowly and without design. Some stones were better for cutting, some bones worked well as needles or awls. The humans noticed, they remembered. They selected materials more carefully. They shaped handles from wood, bound edges with sinew, and tested the weight of an object in their hand before using it. There were no blueprints, no words for design, but there was trial, and error, and memory. This was the beginning of human technology, not brilliance, but perseverance. Some among them were more observant than others. They noticed the way the sun warmed certain slopes more than others. They remembered where the berries grew each year. They tracked the migration of animals in their minds. These people became guides not by title, but by action. Others followed their instincts, trusted their movements. And slowly, a kind of leadership emerged. Not power, not rule, but influence, grounded in experience. They still met other groups now and then. Encounters were unpredictable. Some ended in quiet retreat, others in cautious sharing a tool. Fire, a place to rest. There were conflicts too, silent or sudden. A stolen bundle, a pushed boundary. But each meeting, peaceful or not, left traces anew, not a different tool shape, a remembered face. These exchanges, over time, were the seeds of culture, scattered by wind and need. Death remained close. A misstep on a rocky slope, a sickness that drained strength over days, a wound that festered in silence. They could not stop it, but they responded to it. Sometimes, the dead were covered with branches or buried shallowly in earth. Sometimes, objects were left with the body: a stone, a shell, a piece of meat. These acts, simple as they were, hinted at early thought about the unseen, about memory, about something beyond this life. It was not yet belief, but it was a beginning. In the darkest of winter nights, when hunger pressed hardest and the wind moaned through cracks in stone, they held on to each other. Sleep came in shifts. Eyes opened often. But they endured, because they had to. And slowly, with no signal, the cold began to lift. The sun rose higher, the snow melted, water flowed, trees budded, and food returned. Life, ever fragile, continued. They learned to move with the season. They remembered where the first flowers would bloom, where the roots would soften. The world remained wild, but it was no longer entirely unknown. Each year they grew more familiar with its signs, its warnings, its gifts. They became not just survivors, but adapters, creatures of habit, of foresight, of change. They could not yet see what they would become. They could not know the future that waited. But already, in their slow walk through forests and across plains, in their gathering of stones and kindling, in their care for the young and the fallen, they were building something, a future stitched from struggle. And even as they lived with so little, their minds reached toward warmth, toward memory, toward understanding, not quickly, not clearly, but always forward. As the early humans slowly moved through the landscape, they left no written record, no carved symbols to explain their days, no names to pass down. But they left behind signs, footprints hardened in mud that turned to stone, piles of broken stones where they had chipped tools, bones cracked for marrow, blackened soil where fires had burned. These small remains would one day speak more clearly than words. But in their own time, they meant nothing except what they were: fragments of life in motion. The days were long in the warmer seasons, and with warmth came activity. The early humans ventured further from their shelters. They moved more often, walking silently through meadows, weaving among tall grasses, tracking the faint marks of passing animals. They watched the sky, the water, the wind. These things did not just mark time, they carried meaning. A shift in bird calls might mean danger. A stillness in the air might mean coming rain. Their senses were their guidebooks, and every step taught them something new. They did not think of nature as separate from themselves. The trees were not resources, but part of the world they moved through. The river was not something to own or shape. It simply was. They used what was there, but they did not take more than they needed. A branch for a spear, a handful of berries, a stone for cutting. Their footprints were light, their impact shallow, but their learning was deep. The young continued to grow. They learned quickly, because they had to. A child who watched their parents skin an animal with a sharp flake of stone would one day do the same. A child who tripped in the dark and burned their hand on a fire would not do it twice. Memory became inheritance, not of goods, but of experience. These silent lessons were the only education they had, and they were enough. When it rained, they waited. The world became slick and cold. Fire was difficult to keep alive, and they moved less. Shelter became a place not of comfort, but of survival. They listened to the sound of drops on stone. They sat quietly. They mended what they could. Sometimes, they simply rested, saving their strength. They had no calendars, no sense of days lost. There was only the moment, and what could be done within it. Some days were good, a successful hunt, a full belly, a bright morning after a cold night. These days were marked not with celebration, but with ease. A moment to rest without fear, a pause in the constant press of need. These moments taught them something valuable, that survival was not just about struggle, but about recognizing peace when it came, however briefly. Animals were both threat and sustenance. They feared some, hunted others, watched all. The early humans knew the shape of horns, the sound of hooves, the pattern of movement. They read the earth like a map. A broken branch might tell of a nearby herd. A patch of flattened grass might signal danger. Their lives depended on this reading. One mistake could mean being hunted instead of hunting. There were moments when two groups met in the wild. The outcome of these encounters was never certain. Sometimes there was fire, a gesture, food passed from hand to hand. Other times there was tension, a quiet stillness as each group measured the other. Rarely there was violence, but even that taught them that the world was not only filled with animals, but with other people, other minds, other memories, other stories. Even if those stories were told in silence, at night the fire was still central. It gave light, warmth, protection. but it also gave space for thought. As they sat around its glow, their minds wandered. They watched the sparks rise into the darkness. They listened to the crackle of wood, and sometimes they made sounds, words, not language yet, but sounds that carried emotion, a soft hum, a rhythmic breath, a simple call that meant stay close. These were the beginnings of communication beyond necessity. The stars overhead continued their endless path. The people did not know what they were, but they watched them. Certain points of light returned at regular times. Some moved, some did not. The moon changed, slowly, predictably. These patterns may have comforted them, even if they could not explain them. In a world of uncertainty, the sky was constant, and so it became part of their awareness, part of their quiet wonder. There was no concept of beauty, not as we know it. But still, they made choices that hinted at it. A shell kept longer than it was needed. A piece of ochre scraped smooth. A mark drawn in the dirt again and again. These small acts may have meant nothing practical, but they hinted at something deeper, a need to make, to shape, to mark the world in a way that said, I was here. Even if no one would ever know. Sickness still came and went. Some died young. Others carried wounds for years. There was no medicine, only instinct. Cool water on a fevered head, a poultice of leaves, a soft touch. These things may not have cured, but they showed care. And in a world so harsh, care mattered. It reminded them that they were not alone. That even when they could not speak, they could comfort. And still they moved. Across plains, through forests, along rivers. Always forward, always searching, not just for food, but for safety, for shelter, for something that felt like home, even if only for a night. The world was vast, and they were small. But they moved together, slowly shaping themselves into something more than mere animals. They did not know what they were becoming, but in every act, each step, each fire, each shared glance, they became more human. And the struggle, impossible though it seemed, continued. The land they moved through was never truly familiar, yet over time, it became less strange. With each migration, with each season, they recognized the angle of the hills, the color of the stones, the place where the river curved just so. These memories were not written, not spoken, but carried in the body, in footsteps repeated and paths retraced. They followed the game, the growth of edible plants, the rhythm of the earth as it offered what little it would. And as they wandered, they left subtle marks, stones cleared from a path, a fire circle blackened with old ash, the faint impression of a footprint long since weathered away. In this slow passage through space and time, patterns formed. A certain ridge always had birds nesting in spring. A bend in the river teemed with fish when the sun stood highest. A grove of trees bore fruit, but only for a short window. These lessons were learned again and again, taught not with words but through observation, trial, and the long reach of memory passed between generations, not by language but by repetition. They remembered, not with minds alone but with movement, habits shaped by necessity and retained through survival. The world around them spoke in ways they could not yet describe but deeply understood, the way the wind shifted before a storm, the tension in the air before a predator appeared, the subtle silence of a forest holding its breath. These signals shaped their behavior, not by choice, but by instinct, sharpened by countless generations of those who had not noticed and therefore had not survived. The body became attuned to danger. The group moved together without planning, without commands. A twitch, a glance, a shared sense, and suddenly all were still, or all were moving. As the years passed, some began to live a little longer. Not many. Life remained short, fragile, easily ended. But those who made it past the chaos of youth, avoided falls, wounds, and disease, brought with them something of great value. Experience. They became walking memories. They remembered the place where the roots had once made a child sick. They remembered the cave that had stayed warm through a brutal winter. They had seen others try and fail, had felt hunger and fear, and somehow lived. And though they had no words, others watched them, listened to the quiet ways they chose, and learned. Fire remained sacred. It was never taken for granted. It was never wasted. It was tended like a fragile life. A smoldering branch was often carried for hours between camps, wrapped in bark or moss to keep the embers alive. Starting from scratch was too risky, too uncertain, so they carried the flame with them, not just for warmth, but for protection, for light, for memory. Around it they gathered each night. It became the center of each small world they built. Its crackle was the closest thing they had to song. Its warmth, the closest they came to comfort. In times of calm, some began to experiment. Not intentionally, not with design, but through repetition and curiosity. A sharper stone, a different knot, a harder wood. These small choices became innovations. One person discovered a better way to chip stone by watching how it broke under pressure. Another learned to tie sinew in a loop that held better against strain. These were not inventions in the way we think of them, but moments of change. They spread slowly, they took root, they became habits, and the tools grew better. Language was still far off, but something had changed. Their sounds began to carry more meaning. A certain grunt warned of danger. A gesture meant wait. A sound repeated twice meant look. Over time, these grew more complex. Not sentences, not grammar, but signals, the beginning of shared meaning. Not thoughts turned into words, but feelings shaped into sound. And with this came greater cooperation. They could plan a little. They could warn more clearly. They could express, in a crude but growing way, the many needs of survival. Food was still uncertain. There were days of plenty and days of nothing. A large animal brought down might feed the group for days. But preserving meat was not yet possible beyond drying it in the sun or smoking it over coals. And so they ate what they could while it lasted. Nothing was wasted. Bones were cracked, for marrow. Hides were cleaned, stretched, used. Even teeth were sometimes kept, strung together or carved with lines. Each piece of an animal had value. Nothing was simply thrown away. There were no villages, no fixed homes. The earth was too wild, too unpredictable. But sometimes, they returned to the same place more than once. A familiar cave, a clearing with good water, a patch of ground that faced the morning sun. These became waypoints, places of rest and remembrance. The marks of past fires told them they had been there before. They sat in the same spots. They slept in the same hollows. They moved on again, but the memory of place began to deepen. The young still learned through watching, through falling, through small injuries and hard lessons. There was no shelter from pain, but there was guidance. Older ones helped the young hold tools, watched their first attempts to shape stone. They did not speak, but they showed. They placed hands over smaller hands. They demonstrated. They waited. Learning was slow, but it was steady. There were moments when one group found signs of another. Stones arranged in an unnatural shape, bones left in a pattern, a smear of ochre on a rock face. These markings were not accidents. They were the first signs of expression, of something beyond survival. Perhaps they meant territory, perhaps memory, perhaps nothing we would understand. But to those who left them, they meant something. Night remained both beautiful and frightening. The fire pushed back the dark, but only a little. Beyond it, the world was full of unseen movement. The rustle of leaves, the snap of a branch, the hoot of an owl. Each sound mattered. They listened, always. They slept in shifts. No one was ever truly at rest. But sometimes, under a clear sky, with the stars overhead and the fire steady, they found a kind of peace. And still, they endured day by day, step by step. Across lands that would one day be cities, they walked in silence. They left behind no monuments, no walls, no written words. Only the story of survival, etched in the smallest details, the shape of a flake of stone, the curve of a broken branch, the ashes of a forgotten fire. This was their world. This was their struggle. And it was impossible, yet it continued. Time passed without names. There were no calendars, no counting of years, only the changing of seasons, the aging of bodies, the quiet transformation of the world around them. Trees grew and fell. Rivers shifted their course. Rocks split and crumbled. The early humans moved within this great cycle, unnoticed and unremarked by the earth itself. Yet, in their small actions, they changed, shaped by the land, and slowly, so slowly, beginning to shape it in return. The plants they gathered began to form patterns of preference. Certain roots were dug more often. Certain berries were chosen, again and again. Though they did not farm, they returned to the same places to find the same foods. Over time, these places grew richer with growth, as seeds were dropped or left behind. Without understanding it, they were creating the earliest traces of human ecology. Tiny pockets of land altered by repeated use. The tools in their hands became more refined. Where once a rock was simply broken into two sharp edges, now one edge was shaped deliberately. Flakes were removed with care. Points were made symmetrical. Edges were sharper, more efficient. Not by design in the modern sense, but by instinct and repetition. The tools that worked were copied. The tools that broke were forgotten. This quiet, invisible selection guided the hands of each new generation. The group was everything. There was no survival alone. The old stayed near the fire, offering silent experience. The strong hunted, the cautious watched for threats. The young followed, mimicked, and learned. There were no leaders, not in the way we think of them, but some were listened to more closely, and some were followed more often. Respect was not demanded. It was earned by survival, by care, by memory. When someone died, the group paused. They did not understand death as we do, but they noticed its finality. A body that did not rise, that did not eat or breathe, that lay still long after the fire. Cooled at first, bodies were left behind as the group moved. But over time, something changed. They began to bury. Not always, not consistently, but sometimes. A shallow pit, a covering of soil, a few stones, perhaps even a tool left beside the body. It was the beginning of ritual, of remembrance, of grief, though they had no word for it. The weather shaped everything. A cold year meant hunger, a dry year meant long travel for water. Storms could scatter herds, drought could wither plants. They had no control, only adaptation. When food was scarce, they moved more. When it was abundant, they stayed longer. This constant movement created memory not of dates or facts, but of the land itself. Hills remembered by their shadows, streams remembered by the sound of their flow. These memories were shared by walking together, by returning together, year after year. The animals changed. Some grew scarcer, others appeared in new places. Some grew wary of the humans, sensing the danger of their sharp stones and organized pursuit. A balance was always in motion. Humans took from the land, and the land gave only what it could. Too much taken meant too little left. Though they did not reason it out, they felt the loss. An empty plain where once the deer had been. A forest quieter than before. In times of struggle, they grew quieter. There was no panic, only long silences, careful movement, conserving energy. They spoke even less. The nights were darker, the fires smaller, but they did not give up. Each moment of endurance was an act of will. Not heroic, not grand, just quiet persistence. Somewhere along the way, they began to mark. A hand dipped in ochre pressed against a cave wall. Lines scratched. Into stone, circles, dots, shapes, no clear purpose. Perhaps boredom, perhaps memory, perhaps something sacred. But the need to leave a trace had awakened, to say we were here, even if no one would see it for tens of thousands of years. Clothing remained simple skins, hides, furs, tied around the waist, over the shoulders, stitched crudely with bone needles and sinew. It kept out the cold, kept in body heat, protected against thorns and insects. It was not decorated, not yet, but it was shaped to fit, a small step forward, a small claim on comfort. Fire was sometimes used for more than cooking or warmth. It could clear brush, create openings in dense forest. They learned to use it carefully, though they had no way to control it fully. Fire was dangerous, alive, unpredictable. But it was also the first power they had over nature. It responded to them, grew when fed, died when neglected. It gave them something no other animal had. Nights were always a time of vulnerability, and, yet, they became something more. A time of quiet closeness, of slow thought, of gathering around the fire and watching the flames flicker across stone. The young fell asleep against their mothers. The old stared into the embers, remembering hunts, movements, the faces of those who had gone. It was not happiness, but it was stillness. And in that stillness, something deeper was growing. The humans did not know where they were going. They had no map, no goal beyond surviving the next day, the next season. But in that endless motion, they were changing. They were learning to shape stone, to follow patterns in the stars, to comfort each other, to bury the dead. They were becoming something new. And though they could not name it, they were slowly becoming what we would one day call fully human. The journey was not finished. It had hardly begun. But already, the impossible struggle was bearing fruit. Not in triumph, not in ease, but in slow endurance, in firelight and footsteps, in stone and silence, in lives that passed unnoticed but left behind the shape of everything to come. The rhythm of survival had no finish line. There were no days of rest, no celebrations of conquest, no final victories to mark the end of hardship. Life unfolded in the slow procession of necessity. Every new day required the same work, the same movement, the same caution. Waking meant hunger. Hunger meant motion. Motion meant danger. And danger was everywhere in the weather, in the wild animals, and the unseen illnesses that crept quietly into the body and dimmed its strength. Yet somehow, they woke again, and again, and again. The group itself was not large, perhaps 10, perhaps 20. The exact number changed often. Children were born and died, sometimes within days. Injuries claimed the strongest, while the quietest sometimes lived longest. In these uncertain numbers, the bond between individuals became more important. One pair might hunt well together. One older woman might carry the memory of edible plants. Others had forgotten. A young boy might notice tracks others had missed. Even the smallest contribution could tip the balance between hunger and enough. They did not praise one another with words, but they watched, they remembered, and those who helped were valued. In the quiet way of a people who had no language for affection, but understood its meaning. As time passed, they began to adapt more deeply. Their bodies hardened, feet calloused from walking on stone, fingers thickened from years of gripping rough tools. Their eyes grew sharp in dim light. Their hearing learned to separate the whisper of wind from the footstep of a stalking predator. Their skin bore the scars of survival, cuts healed poorly, burns from fires, animal bites narrowly escaped. But each mark was a lesson, a memory written into flesh. The seasons changed again. The days shortened. The sun moved lower in the sky. Food grew scarce. The animals thinned or migrated. The plants withered. The air grew sharper, and the wind cut deeper through the trees. They moved less now, not by choice, but because each step burned more energy than it saved. They huddled near the fire, conserving strength. Meals were smaller, more carefully divided. Every mouthful mattered. Sometimes they found caves, overhangs of rock, or spaces between fallen trees. These places became temporary homes, occupied not with comfort but with hope. They added to them in simple ways. Stones arranged into barriers against wind, branches pulled across openings, skins stretched to block the rain. These were not buildings, not yet, but they were beginnings. The desire to shape a space, to control the environment even slightly, was awakening in the darkest nights. The old stories began not told as stories, but as gestures, as mimicry. One might move their hands to show the shape of an animal. Another would respond with the motion of throwing a spear. A third might add a sound, a grunt, a breath, a growl. Laughter, rare and brief, might break through the silence. These simple moments were the seed of culture. Not yet stories as we know them, but shared memory, performed and remembered through movement. The birth of a child was both joy and burden. It meant new life, but also new risk. The mother would move more slowly, need more food. The child, helpless for so long, required constant warmth, constant carrying, constant attention. But the group understood this in the way animals do. The young must be protected. If they survived, they would grow strong, and strength was everything. So the others helped. They carried firewood, shared food, made space near the warmest part of the fire. No one said thank you. But the care was there. Water remained both necessity and danger. A clear stream could quench thirst or conceal disease. A river might offer fish but sweep a careless foot away in its current. They learned to watch water, to judge its sound, its clarity, its motion. They learned which pools dried up too quickly, and which springs stayed cool even in heat. They drank from cupped hands, or from hollowed stones filled and left near the fire. Each act, though small, was part of the long learning of survival. Once they encountered another group, not by plan but by accident. Tracks converged. Fires burned in the same valley. At first, they watched from afar. Then one group moved forward, cautious, hands open, stones lowered. No words passed between them, only glances, small signs. They shared the space for a night, then two. Perhaps they exchanged a tool. Perhaps one stayed behind, then they moved on. The memory of the meeting lingered. Not all humans were enemies. Some were simply others. Wounds were tended, as best they could be, a leaf wrapped around a cut, a coal pressed near a sting. There were no cures, but there were attempts. They learned through repetition which plants helped pain, which made it worse, which wounds could be survived, and which could not. The knowledge passed not in words, but in watching, in doing, in remembering. As their tools improved, so too did their ability to hunt. Spears hardened by fire, stones tied to shafts. These new weapons required coordination, practice, timing. A group could surround prey, drive it toward a trap, bring it down more cleanly. This changed their relationship with animals. They were no longer merely opportunistic. They became predators in their own right. This shift was slow but significant. It allowed them to shape their destiny a little more each season. But with this power came risk. Injuries from large animals became more frequent. The chase was dangerous. A single misstep and a hunter could be trampled, gored, or fall from a cliff. The gain was high, but so was the cost. Still, they accepted it. Hunger pushed harder than fear, and when one was lost, they grieved in their silent way, standing near the body, heads lowered, hands still. Sleep remained brief, restless, broken by shifts and sounds, but in it they dreamed of what we cannot know, perhaps of past hunts, of falling, of light in the trees. The dreams meant little at the time, but in centuries to come, those dreams would become stories, myths, beliefs. For now, they were only private flickers of meaning, drifting through the quiet dark. The struggle did not end. The cold returned. The earth shifted, but the people endured, not through strength alone, but through memory, cooperation, small acts, repeated over and over across generations. This was not a golden age. It was not a fall from grace. It was the long, impossible road of becoming human. And it continued, step by step, fire by fire, hand to hand, and to a future still unborn. The movement never stopped. One camp became another, and then another. The rivers they once drank from dried or flooded. The forests shifted as trees aged and fell. Animals they once followed changed their paths, or vanished entirely. And so, they followed too. The earth was not a map, but a memory. They followed remembered hills, long rocks, familiar trees. They moved by pattern, not by plan. The world gave no promises, only possibilities. In time, their feet wore paths through the grass and soil, though they did not think of them as roads. They were simply the lines the body knew to follow, because others had walked them before. Over generations, these same paths connected water to shelter, feeding ground to safety, birth to death. The land itself began to remember them, even if they had no names to offer it in return. The children always followed. They carried nothing but themselves. They watched, they mimicked, they learned. One child would practice holding a stone like the older ones did, tapping it awkwardly, flaking off uneven shards. Another might follow the hunter's steps exactly, placing feet and footprints, silent and careful, learning without knowing. They were taught by gesture, by repetition, by survival itself. Words were rare. Meaning was not. Fire remained sacred. It was never left behind. Someone always carried a timbers wrapped in bark, cradled in moss, nestled in a carved stone. If it went out, They tried again with sparks, with dry grass, with patience and hope. But the fire was more than heat. It was safety, light, protection, ritual. The night without fire was a night full of fear. The night with fire was one where the group drew close, silent, and watched the glowing coals in quiet thought. In those flames, thoughts sometimes drifted far from the body. They stared at the fire and thought of the past, of faces no longer with them, of places now far away. These thoughts had no words, but they had shape, feeling, presence. They were the first beginnings of memory, not just for use, but for longing. The idea that something gone could still live inside you, quietly, was new. Their tools grew more varied. Scrapers for hides, awls for piercing holes, carved handles for better grip. Every improvement came not from invention in the modern sense, but from doing something 1,000 times, and noticing a better way on the 1,000th. There were no blueprints, no instructions, only hands and memory and the will to try again, and again, and again. Their shelters became more thoughtful. When they found a cave, they arranged their fire in the best part where smoke could rise, and wind was blocked. When they stayed near a cliff or fallen tree, they placed stones in a half circle. When time allowed, they added branches, skins, bone. It was not architecture, but it was design. The instinct to shape space to make it theirs was growing. And with that instinct came something deeper. They began to decorate, slowly and rarely, a pattern scratched into bone, a necklace of teeth, a line of red ochre across the forehead. These were not for survival. They were not for use. They were for meaning, for self, for group, for something that was not necessary, but still mattered. The beginnings of culture, of art, of identity, flickered into being like sparks from their fire. Some of them began to understand that stones were not all the same. Certain rocks flaked better. Some made sharper edges. Some were too soft, others too brittle. They learned to look for the right kind. They carried it with them when they could. This was the beginning of preference, of resource recognition. And slowly, the land became not just space, but a place with purpose, where good stone could be found, where useful plants grew, where the deer always passed, in their season. Language remained in its early shadow. Sounds were clicks, cries, but they were more than noise. They were signals, a warning, a reassurance, a question. Over time, these sounds repeated in the same moments, and others began to associate them with meaning. Still no grammar, still no long sentences, but meaning was growing teeth. A spoken thread connecting one mind to another. There were no borders, only distances. No homes, only places where one slept for a while. Yet, even this rootlessness carried a kind of map. They remembered the places of abundance, the cliffs that echoed strangely, the lake that never dried. These were their markers. The earth told stories, and they listened, not with ears, but with footsteps. Their social life remained silent, simple, and strong. They shared without counting. They moved without asking. They protected one another because that was the only way the group could live. There were no laws, no punishments, but there were expectations. The selfish were noticed. The helpful were remembered. Trust was not spoken. It was earned with time, through presence, through pain endured together. Hunger never left them. Even in good times, it lingered just behind the ribcage, a quiet reminder. But hunger also shaped their sense of time. They did not think in days, but in meals, not in hours, but in actions. They marked life by when they ate, when they hunted, when they rested. That was their clock, and it was always ticking forward. They knew the stars, not as constellations, but as lights that marked the sky. Some returned every season, others vanished. They may have used them for navigation, or simply watched them to remember. The night sky was familiar, constant, and offered a kind of comfort in its repetition. When the world below changed, the stars remained. Some nights they danced, not to music, but to rhythm. A beat struck on stone or wood, a step repeated, movements passed between bodies, simple and steady. This too was communication, ritual, belonging. It stirred something deep in the chest, something older than speech, They danced to feel their body. They danced to know they were still alive. Their struggle continued. It was not epic. It was not heroic. It was slow, ordinary, and without end. And yet it was magnificent in its endurance. Each step taken by those bare, hardened feet brought all of us closer to what we would become. Not because they tried to build the future, but because they refused to stop walking through the past. In the slow turning of the earth, where days passed without fanfare and years left no written record, early humans pressed onward through the repetition of survival. They did not count time as we do. There were no calendars, no schedules, no written marks scratched into stone to recall what had passed. Time was measured by seasons and shifts: the budding of certain plants, the reappearance of certain birds, the return of warmth, or the first cold bite of wind. These moments defined their understanding of the world. Not in dates, but in rhythms. Not in numbers, but in patterns. The air around them always carried sound. Wind in trees, insects, the distant call of animals. But the sounds of other humans were most important. The cough of someone falling ill, the footfall of a hunter approaching the camp, the cry of a child, the murmur of people moving in the dark. These sounds created their sense of belonging. They did not need to see each other to feel safety. They needed to hear that they were not alone. Food remained the anchor of every day. Whether it came from plants plucked from the earth, or meat wrestled from the wild, it dictated their actions. Berries came with summer. Roots could be dug before the frost. Meat was stored in the memory of a recent hunt, sometimes dried, sometimes buried in cool soil. There was no abundance, only balance. A wrong choice could mean starvation. A single lucky moment catching a fish or finding a ripe tree could mean an extra day of life for everyone. Illness came silently. No one understood its source. A small wound might swell, change color, grow hot. A child who had run the day before might now lie still, eyes distant, breath short. These moments were met not with panic, but with quiet resignation. They did what they could, cooling the forehead, sharing extra food, staying near. And sometimes it worked. Sometimes it did not. There were no cures, only presence as tools. Improved, so did the ability to shape the world in small ways. Stones were tied more securely to wooden handles, using strips of sinew or plant fiber. Animal hides were stretched, scraped, and softened to make coverings from cold. These small acts allowed for more time away from fire, more movement in winter, more possibility in hostile conditions. They began to make things that lasted, not just because they needed to, but because they wanted to remember what worked. Some began to experiment with shapes. A piece of wood bent and sharpened, not just to stab, but to throw. A net woven from plant fibers to trap small animals. These early innovations required patience and trial, often passed from one hand to another without explanation. Children watched. The weaving of netting, the binding of stones, the sharpening of bone. Their hands practiced the motions long before they understood the purpose. In this way, knowledge moved forward, not in words, but in repetition. Fire became more than warmth. It became a place, the center of every night. Around it, stories formed it, in sentences, but in gestures, in fragments of sound, in glances and shared memories. Someone would act out a chase. Another would mimic a fall. Others would laugh quietly, or nod with understanding. These performances were not entertainment. They were education, they were memory. They were the first attempts to pass meaning forward. The sky changed above them. Sometimes the moon was full and bright. Sometimes it vanished. They may not have understood its cycle, but they noticed. Just as they noticed when certain stars reappeared or vanished. They might not have named them, but they knew them. The world above and the world below were linked, even if they did not yet know how. Children played, even in hard times. They mimicked the adults, pretending to gather, to throw, to climb. They laughed, they chased each other. And their play was learning, yes, but also something else. Resilience. A reminder that even under constant threat, joy was not impossible. The instinct to laugh, to pretend, to connect through imagination, was already there. Their hands bore the map of their life. Fingers hardened by labor, palms creased by work. nails worn or broken. Yet with those same hands, they built, they carried, they comforted. The human hand, capable of such precision and such strength, was both weapon and tool, expression and necessity. With it they shaped not only their tools, but their world. Sometimes two groups met against strangers who did not fight. They approached slowly, sharing signs of peace. A stone offered, a fire shared. For a night, they rested near one another. They exchanged things, perhaps food, perhaps tools, perhaps companionship. Then, just as quietly, they moved on. But the memory of the meeting lingered. They were not entirely alone in the world. Others like them lived and moved through the same wild spaces. When death came, it came without ceremony, but not without notice. A body was sometimes left in a quiet place, covered with stones or tucked beneath branches. In time, this became more consistent, a practice, a habit, maybe even a ritual. Perhaps red ochre was applied, perhaps objects were left nearby. The line between survival and reflection grew thinner. They had begun to wonder not just how to live, but what life meant. The long journey continued, not a straight path, not a race, but a slow unfolding. Their feet moved forward because there was no other direction. Their minds adapted because the world required it. They did not know they were changing. They did not know they were becoming something more. But they were. They moved not toward civilization, but through it in its earliest whispers. A scrape of color on stone, a carving on bone, a pattern worn around the neck. They were still prey, still vulnerable, still always at the edge of survival. But within them stirred something eternal, not just to live, but to leave a mark, no matter how faint. The days and nights continued to pass in slow procession, each one neither remarkable nor meaningless. Life was not lived in stories, but in sensations: the chill of morning air on bare skin, the crunch of dry twigs underfoot, the taste of gathered roots softened by fire, the rustle of movement beyond the edge of the firelight. These moments accumulated like dust on stone. No single instant mattered more than another, but together they formed the entire world. Shelter remained temporary, a lean-to of branches and hides, a cave mouth with a windbreak, a pit dug into the earth and covered for warmth. Each solution arose from need, and each was forgotten the moment it ceased to be useful. Yet even these fleeting structures showed thought: protection from wind, from animals, from rain. As they built and rebuilt, they carried knowledge forward, not in words, but in form. Each shelter was a memory, silently shaped. The human body itself adapted, feet hardened from walking barefoot over stone and thorn, eyes adjusted to dark beneath forest canopies, muscles learned to carry loads and throw with strength. The mind learned to notice patterns: what plants grew near water, where the animals drank, which berries caused pain, and which could be eaten. These observations became instinct. They were not written or spoken. They were passed in blood, in bone, in behavior. Their lives followed the animals, and the animals followed the seasons. Herds moved with the wind. Predators followed the herds, and humans followed both. Sometimes they found fresh tracks in mud. Sometimes they saw feathers scattered where a bird had been taken. Sometimes they saw nothing, and their stomachs tightened with the knowledge that food would not come easily today. But still, they moved forward. Their groups remained small, a dozen, sometimes more, sometimes fewer. Faces they saw every day, voices they knew by sound alone. Children knew no other world than these people, and when someone disappeared, taken by sickness, by injury, by time, the absence echoed across every movement. A hand once held no longer reached, a voice once heard no longer spoke. They grieved not with ritual, but with silence. Water was never taken for granted. Streams might dry, rain might not come. A clean pool was precious. Some learned to find it by watching animals, others by recognizing plants that grew only near it. They cupped it in their hands, carried it in hollowed stones, shared it without measure. Water was life, and every drink was a small victory over the constant pull of thirst. Tools improved in slow, quiet ways, not with invention, but with persistence. A sharper flake, a better grip, a curve that fit the hand. Every tool told us of genius, but of attention. Someone had struck a stone 100 times, and on the 101st, it broke just right. And they remembered, not in language, but in action. They made another the same way, then another. Then they showed someone else. In time, some began to shape tools for tasks other than hunting. A smoother edge for scraping hides, a pointed stick for digging roots. These shifts were small, but they mattered. A tool meant less energy spent, more food gathered, more safety found. Time, once consumed entirely by survival, could now stretch ever so slightly. And in those stretched moments, thought expanded. They began to mark things, with lines, with colors, with scratches in the walls of caves, perhaps to count, perhaps to remember, perhaps for reasons lost to us forever. A handprint pressed in ochre against rock, a spiral etched into bone. These were not decorations, they were decisions. A choice to leave something behind, a moment of expression that reached beyond need. Music may have begun in the quiet tapping of sticks or stones, a rhythm repeated, a beat shared, a sound that felt familiar and calming. No melody, no harmony, just rhythm, like footsteps, like heartbeat. They might have hummed low sounds to babies, whispered tones that calmed one another. They had no songs, not yet, but they had repetition, and with it came comfort. The night remained the boundary they could never cross fully. Even with fire, there were limits. Beyond the glow, predators waited. Eyes gleamed in the dark. Every sound held the weight of danger. They huddled close, fire between them and the unknown, and still they endured. Night after night, fire after fire. Life continued at times. Nature changed around them in larger ways. A drought, a storm, a landslide that blocked a valley, a river that carved a new path. These events disrupted everything. Suddenly, a familiar route became impassable. A source of food disappeared. The group had to adapt. Some turned back. Others ventured into new territory. With every crisis came risk, but also the seed of learning. Their knowledge of the land deepened. They recognized not just places, but signs. A bird's call meant fruit nearby. A certain flower warned of poison. Cracks in the soil meant water. Below, their minds held a mental map, built not with names, but with memory. Each tree, each bend in the river, each cave mouth, they knew them not as places, but as chapters in the story of survival. There were no leaders, no laws, but there was order. The strong carried the weak. The experienced made the first cut of meat. The patient taught the young. They had no words for roles, but they filled them. No rules for justice, but they remembered kindness. And slowly, very slowly, a moral sense began to form, not written, not spoken, but shared. Rain brought renewal in difficulty. It softened the ground, fed the plants, filled the pools. But it also brought cold, wet hides, mud, sickness. Still, they welcomed it. When it came after dry months, it felt like relief. They learned to follow the seasons closely, not with calendars, but with skin, with hunger, with breath. The world taught them slowly, and they listened. They had no origin story, no myth to explain themselves. Only movement, only the endless now. But the fact that they continued, day after day, storm after storm, was itself a kind of answer. They existed because they endured. They endured because they moved. They moved because to stay still was to fade. Every gesture, every shared moment, every new idea, these were not just parts of survival. They were the slow gathering of something larger. Not civilization, not yet, but something on its way. And even though they could not see it, they carried it with them. In every footstep, every spark of fire, every decision to help another instead of walk away. The slow passage of time continued, as it always had, unnoticed by those moving through it. The early humans did not measure their years, nor did they speak of decades or generations. Instead, they marked time by the return of animals, the budding of trees, and the deepening cold that came with each passing winter. Their lives were cycles, not lines. Repetition, not progress. Yet, slowly and invisibly, change was taking root. They moved often, never staying in one place too long, for the land could only give so much before it needed to rest. A grove that once offered fruit would be bare for months. A hunting ground would fall silent. A water source might dry. So they moved again, following the memory of food, the promise of shelter, and the patterns of nature they came to understand so well. Their feet became maps. Their minds became calendars. A bend in a river, a certain tree, a cluster of stones, all of it encoded with meaning. One place meant danger, another meant rest. Over time, their movements formed fixed roads, but familiar trails that guided them through uncertainty. They did not name these places, but they knew them as well as we know the rooms of our homes. Language, still not fully formed, began to grow in complexity. Not with grammar or rules, but with sounds that came to hold meaning. A grunt could mean warning, a gesture, hunger. Over time, those gestures and sounds began to pair. A call for danger, a sign for food, a soft coo to comfort a child. These were not yet sentences, but they were more than noise. They were the beginnings of shared thought that the children learned by watching. They saw how a fire was fed, how a stone was chipped, how meat was divided. No one stood to teach, yet everything was a lesson. Children imitated what they saw. Sometimes they failed, often they failed, but failure was not punished. It was part of learning. And when they succeeded, even in small things, the group moved forward just a little more prepared. The body of knowledge was growing. How to strip sinew from a carcass, how to weave it into strong thread, how to boil certain roots to remove bitterness. These things were not written. They were practiced, preserved in muscle memory and habit. The young learned from the old. The old carried knowledge no one else had. This gave them purpose. Even as their strength faded, the nights remained long, especially in winter. Around the fire, with nothing but darkness beyond, they shared presence. They pointed to scars and told their stories. Not with words as we know them, but with mimed gestures, repeated sounds, and shared memories. These were not stories for entertainment. They were repositories of wisdom, lessons wrapped in the cloak of memory. Sometimes they met other strangers who looked like them, moved like them, but did not smell or sound the same. These encounters were dangerous. Fear was natural, but so was curiosity. A shared meal, a traded tool, a moment of quiet around a common fire. These were tentative first steps toward something deeper than survival. The first threads of community, stretched across distance. From these interactions came new things. A sharper kind of spearhead, a new method of preserving meat, a way to tan hides that made them softer, longer lasting. The knowledge from another group became part of their own. In this way, innovation spread not like fire, but like a slow-moving wind, unseen but shaping everything in its path. As they moved through their world, they began to leave marks behind. Not always on purpose, a flattened trail, a stone pile marking a burial, a smear of color on a cave wall. These traces lingered. Perhaps the people returned to them. Perhaps others found them and paused. In these places, memory took root, not individual memory, but something larger, something collective. They learned from their failures. A flood that took a child, a tree that split in a storm, a fall that broke a bone. These events were not forgotten. They became lessons, avoided places, better shelters, new caution. This slow accumulation of insight was not dramatic. It did not transform them overnight, but it meant the next child might live where another had not. The climate shifted, sometimes slowly, sometimes quickly. A warming wind, a longer dry season, more snow than before. These changes forced adaptation. Some animals disappeared, new ones arrived. The humans moved, adjusted, improvised. Some did not survive, but others did. And those who did, carried with them new ways of thinking, new tools, and a deeper understanding of the fragile balance between them and the world. There were no guarantees. A good season could be followed by a terrible one. A full belly one day could give way to hunger the next. But through it all, they kept going. Not because they had a vision of the future, but because they had no choice. Life was not something to plan, it was something to endure. Each day met with grit, each loss absorbed, each small success clutched tightly. And yet, amidst all this struggle, there were moments of peace, a still morning with mist rising over a river. the quiet comfort of sleeping beside someone trusted, the gentle hum of voices murmuring in the dark, a child's laughter as they stumbled through a game. These fragments did not change the world, but they made it bearable. Their bones grew stronger from labor. Their eyes learned to track movement at the edge of the forest. Their fingers became skilled at tying knots, scraping hides, and shaping tools. But most importantly, their minds became attuned to cause and effect. They noticed what others did not. They remembered. They learned to expect the world to behave in certain ways. And from this, a fragile kind of logic began to take form. Fire remained sacred, its source unknown, its behavior unpredictable, yet its benefits undeniable. It dried wet hides. It warded off animals. It softened food. It warmed cold bodies. Keeping it alive became a shared duty. Losing it was a crisis. And when lightning struck dry brush and started a new flame, it was seen not as random, but as gift. They may not have understood it, but they respected it deeply. In time, the people changed slowly, their skulls subtly different, their tools more refined, their campsites more complex. But these changes did not come with ceremony or recognition. They simply lived, and the world shaped them. And in turn, they shaped the world one cautious footstep, one spark, one sharpened stone at a time. With each passing season, the people continued their quiet struggle, not against the world, but within it. They had no vision of triumph. There were no plans to conquer the land, no maps to expand. Instead, there was presence, immediate, constant, a steady gaze on the ground before them, a life shaped by what was near, not by what could be imagined. Their world was one of texture and scent, the feel of smooth stones worn by the river, the dryness of wind that warned of no rain, the sharpness of smoke in the lungs. They understood their environment not as something to analyze, but as something to sense, and through repetition they knew it intimately. A rustle in grass might mean prey, or danger. A shadow across the sun might mean a change in weather, or nothing at all. Over time, their tools became more than just tools. A spear carved well was kept. Its balance mattered. Its weight remembered. It became more than a stick, it became a companion, something trusted. The hands that shaped it knew how to shape another. But this one, the familiar one, stayed close. It traveled with them, through forests, across plains, over rivers, not out of sentiment, but out of simple value. Shelter, too, became more refined. Though still temporary, it was arranged with increasing care. Stones to hold warmth, hides to catch rain, openings that faced away from wind. The details mattered. They made the difference between a cold night and a survivable one. And slowly, in the construction of these spaces, the mind reached beyond the moment. It began to plan. Fire was kept alive as if it were part of the group. Coals were buried to protect them from wind. A smoldering branch was carried from place to place. A single ember could mean the difference between warmth and exposure, between food and hunger. Those who tended the fire were trusted. They had no titles, but their role mattered. The night remained long, and in its shadows, imagination stirred. Shapes in the dark became animals or spirits. A sound on the wind became a voice, perhaps a warning. Without language to frame their thoughts, these experiences sank into the body, into the pulse. Over time, these fears took form not in belief systems, not yet, but in caution, in ritual, in small gestures of respect to the unknown. As groups encountered each other, conflict was not uncommon. Resources were few. Trust was hard. But not every meeting led to violence. Sometimes there was trade. A polished stone for dried meat, a sharp blade for a woven cord. And when peace was found, even for a moment, it gave both groups something. They lacked new tools, new knowledge, new understanding. These exchanges, though rare, were powerful. They sowed the seeds of something broader than kinship, something approaching cooperation. And in those moments, the boundaries of the self began to stretch. Not just my family, not just my group, but perhaps, in time, something more. An awareness of others, not as threats, but as beings with their own needs, their own ways still. The daily rhythm remained mostly unchanged. Wake with the light, walk to find food. listen to the wind, smell the air, watch the sky, make fire, eat when food was found. Rest when the body demanded it, sleep when darkness fell. There were no clocks, no deadlines, only survival, only breath. And yet, even within this cycle, there were moments of creation. A figure scratched into the bark of a tree, a pattern traced in the dust, a pile of stones stacked just so. These acts served no purpose, and that is what made them important. They were the beginnings of meaning outside of function, the earliest signs that the mind was not only aware but wondering. In time, the people began to shape their world more actively. Stones arranged to guide animals, small fires set to clear brush. These were primitive forms of management, not farming. Not yet, but actions with intent. They were no longer only reacting to the land. They were beginning to influence it. Seasons passed, and with them, generations. Faces changed, bodies aged, children grew. Those who remembered taught those who would soon forget them. But what was passed down: how to shape a flake, how to spot edible fungus, how to tend a wound. These became the foundation for everything to come. Not consciously, but inevitably. Their understanding of pain deepened, too, not just injury, but loss. The death of a child, the disappearance of a mate, the long absence of someone who went to hunt and did not return. These losses were felt deeply, even if they had no names. Grief was real, even if it could not be described. And so they developed small ways to hold it. A pile of stones, a favorite tool left behind, a place not visited again. Memory was born. In these quiet gestures, memory not just as recall, but as meaning. This person mattered, this moment mattered, and even when it faded, the gesture remained, passed on, echoed. And with each repetition, the mind reached farther, began to see itself as part of a larger whole. They began to stay longer in certain places. Not to settle, but to pause. A valley rich with game. A hill where the wind was soft. A cave that stayed warm even in winter. These places became known, recognized, shared between groups. And in returning to them year after year, they began to shape a relationship with the land. A sense of belonging, even if they could not name it. Food remained the great decider. When there was enough, peace was easier. Curiosity grew. Children played. People sat and watched clouds, insects, birds. When food was scarce, everything contracted. The body, the mind, the group. Movement resumed. Risk returned. Hunger changed everything, and yet, hunger also taught them which roots could be eaten raw, which insects had more fat, how to trap fish using woven reeds, how to find honey without being stung. These discoveries came not through invention, but desperation. They were the answers to questions not asked in words, but in need. The world itself was in flux. Ice retreated, forests spread, rivers carved new paths, animals migrated, plants adapted. The people followed, watched, learned. They had no understanding of climate or geology, but they saw the effects, and in their quiet way, they responded. They did not resist change, they moved with it, and in doing so, they survived. They did not know that they were shaping history. There was no awareness of progress, no sense of time marching forward. They were simply living, responding to each day as it came, adjusting, adapting, enduring. Yet with each passing year, they became more than what they had been. The changes were slow, imperceptible even to them, but they were real. A different way of tying a cord, a better method for scraping a hide, a new way of storing embers. And bit by bit, their world became slightly more manageable. They remained deeply connected to the cycles of nature. The migration of animals continued to dictate movement. The fruiting season of plants was remembered, not on a calendar, but in the body's rhythm. Rains brought renewal, but also danger. Drought brought suffering, but also discovery. There was no predictability, only familiarity. And even that could not be trusted completely. They began to return to certain places again and again, as if drawn by memory. A bend in the river where fish were always found. A rocky outcrop where birds nested. A sheltered grove that provided berries. These places grew in significance not through ownership, but through meaning. They were dependable, and in a world of constant uncertainty, dependability was sacred. Still, they moved. Movement was life. Staying too long brought danger. Food ran out, predators came close, illness spread. So even as they grew familiar with places, they never called them home in the way we understand it. Home was the group, the fire, the shared space. Wherever they were together, that was safety. The development of their minds continued, quietly and slowly. They began to group events into patterns. When certain stars appeared in the sky, the animals returned. When particular flowers bloomed, the rains came soon after. This was not science. It was experience, sharpened by repetition. But it was the beginning of understanding cause and effect in the natural world. As language became more complex, ideas could be shared more clearly. It was still limited, no formal grammar, no complex structures, but it was powerful. A warning could be given before danger appeared. Instructions could be passed without demonstration. Simple stories could be told, filled with remembered events, creatures, places. It brought the group closer, aligned their attention, and deepened their shared world. That there was still violence, a scarcity of resources, a clash between groups, a dispute over space or food. These things were unavoidable. But as communication improved, so did the possibility of resolution. Sometimes, peace prevailed, an offering of meat, a tool left behind, a gesture of submission, and over time, these acts became understood, not just as actions, but as symbols of meaning. And in these symbols, something new was born, the early glimmer of culture. Not in the way we define it today, with art and philosophy, but in the shared practices and behaviors that gave structure to life. A way of doing things, a way of marking a birth or a death, a way of showing respect or deferring to experience. These behaviors were not taught in words. They were absorbed through life itself. Their bodies bore the story of their existence. Scarred hands from years of tool making, calloused feet from endless walking, bent backs from gathering, worn teeth from tough, unprocessed food. Yet in these signs of labor was also resilience. They had grown stronger, tougher, more suited to the world around them. They carried the memory of survival in every limb. Fire remained central, more than warmth, more than cooking. It was a gathering point. It gave a sense of control, however small. Around the fire, stories were shared. Not epic tales, but simple events, successful hunt, a remembered storm, a dangerous crossing. And as these stories were repeated, they became more than memory. They became knowledge. Collective wisdom passed from the old to the young. Some of the older ones remembered things the others did not. Places long abandoned, animals no longer seen. They became keepers of memory. Even when their strength faded, their presence mattered. They reminded the group of what had been, and in doing so, they gave the group a longer sense of self, not just today, not just tomorrow, but a faint sense of before. Tools became more refined. A blade chipped from stone held its edge longer. A scraping tool could clean a hide more efficiently. A woven net could trap fish where hands could not. These were not inventions, not in the modern sense. They were discoveries through trial, refined by necessity. And each refinement gave the group a small advantage, just enough to make the next day possible. Children were central. They were the reason to move forward, the future made flesh. They were watched constantly, protected fiercely, taught gently. Their laughter was rare, but when it came, it was sacred. They carried the potential for something more. They were born into a hard world, but with each child, the group dared to hope that something might change. When someone died, the group felt it. There were no ceremonies, but there were actions: covering the body with stones, placing objects nearby, sitting in silence. These were gestures of grief, born from pain, shaped by instinct, and from them grew the first expressions of remembrance. Not because they understood death, but because they could not ignore it. The natural world remained unpredictable. Storms arrived without warning, rivers flooded, wildfires consumed entire areas, animals turned aggressive. Illness swept through the group, yet through all of it, they endured. Not because they were strong, but because they adapted. They learned. They did not fight the world. they moved with it, and in doing so, they survived. Some groups stayed close to rivers, others roamed wide grasslands. Some took shelter in forests. Their ways of life differed slightly, shaped by their environment, and with each new place, new knowledge emerged. Different plants to eat, different animals to hunt, different threats to avoid. And slowly, across these groups, a silent, shared evolution was underway. Though they remained far from what we would call civilization, they were no longer simply surviving. They were becoming something more. They were forming a relationship with the land, with each other, with time. Still fragile, still uncertain, but undeniably human. Their journey was far from over. The great challenges of the world, famine, fire, flood, war still lay ahead. But so too did the small moments of peace, of comfort, of warmth in the cold, of company in the dark, of knowledge passed hand to hand, and of the first seeds of something greater, something that would one day be called history. As the earth continued its slow turning, early humans followed its rhythms without ever needing to understand them. They moved with the light and stilled with the dark. They did not rush. They did not delay. Each step forward was determined by the simplest truth: what could be found, what could be done, and what could be endured. Seasons passed, and in those cycles of heat and cold, rain and drought, they found a shape to their lives, not a plan, not a future, but a pattern that comforted them even in its unpredictability. The landscape shaped them as much as they shaped it. In the lowlands, they walked paths worn by animals, their feet placing themselves into the same shallow indentations left by hooves and paws before them. In the highlands, they found vantage points, not for beauty, but for safety. From there, they could see the slow movement of herds, or the distant dance of a fire, far away and unfamiliar. In those fires, they sensed other people, like them, yet unknown. The wind carried more than air. It brought scent, it brought danger, it brought memory. The smell of smoke, the smell of wet leaves, the faint temps of blood. Their noses learned what mattered. Their ears picked out the rustle of prey. From the whisper of wind, their eyes adjusted to every flicker of shadow, each sense sharpened by generations of watching and waiting. They didn't speak of instincts, they simply had them. At night the stars wheeled slowly above. They did not know them by name, but they knew their positions. A certain pattern meant the cold was coming. Another suggested the herds were near. They lay on their backs and watched, not to learn, but because there was nothing else to do. Silence settled over them. The crackle of fire, the breathing of the group. The night held stillness. Sometimes, one of them would hum, a low sound, no melody, just a tone, repeated. It did not have meaning, but it held something close to it: comfort, perhaps, or memory. The others listened, or didn't. It was not performance, it was presence. The voice joined the fire, the wind, the dark, and slowly, that hum became part of what it meant to rest there. Hands never stopped working. Even in waiting, they shaped things. A cord twisted from fibers, a stone flake sharpened just a bit more, a net untangled. Hands remembered what words could not yet say, and those hands passed knowledge from the old to the young, not in lessons, but in repetition. Do as I do, the hand said. Watch closely, feel carefully. Birth was pain, it was also hope. A child's arrival did not change the world, but it reminded them of its continuity. The small cries, the reaching fingers, the helplessness, all of it familiar, all of it precious. They did not name their children in the way we might imagine, but they knew each one. They remembered the day they came, the struggles of their mothers, the first time they sat, the first steps. These things mattered not as events, but as part of the unbroken chain of life. Occasionally they met others, different faces, different habits. Sometimes there was tension, eyes narrowed, bodies tensed. But not every encounter was a threat. Sometimes, after much watching and waiting, they approached, exchanged things, not just tools and food, but gestures, ways of doing, knowledge from different soil, a kind of learning that expanded the known world. These meetings seeded change, new ways to trap fish, a different use for bark, a softer weave for clothing, a new sound added to their simple songs. Culture was not invented, was shared. Quietly, cautiously, gradually there were no buildings, no cities. But there were places they returned to again and again. A cave with marks on its walls, a bend in the river that caught fish easily, a cluster of trees where animals passed. These places gathered memory, without words, without plans. They became sacred, not in the religious sense, but in the sense that they mattered, that they were known. There were no leaders, not yet, but some voices were listened to more than others. An elder who had survived many winters, a tracker who always knew where to go, a gatherer whose eyes missed nothing. Respect was not demanded, was earned by doing and by surviving. And over time, those who were most relied upon became the ones others followed, gently, without command. Dreams began to carry weight, not because they were understood, but because they lingered. A strange image, a voice heard in sleep, a memory of someone lost. These dreams mattered. They were spoken of in the morning, not to analyze, but to share. They hinted at another world, just out of reach. And slowly, those dreams shaped their thinking about life, about death, about things unseen. They did not call it belief. But belief was there, forming quietly. A sense that the world was more than what was visible. A rock could hold power. A tree could listen. An animal's spirit could linger after death. These ideas gave shape to their fears, and to their hopes. Not religion, not yet, but a reaching outward beyond the fiery light. Weather remained a teacher. The cold taught preparation. The rain taught shelter. The wind taught patience. Nothing could be controlled, only endured. And in that endurance they learned to work together. To share food, to shield one another, to build what little they had. In ways that protected not just themselves, but their group. They rarely laughed, but when they did, it was real. A child tumbling into leaves, a stranger making a strange sound, a sudden surprise in the hunt. Laughter was not an escape, it was a pause, a breath in the middle of effort, and it reminded them that even in difficulty, there was still room for joy. They grew old slowly, then all at once, a strong hunter, limping, a gatherer whose sight faded, a fire tender whose hands began to shake. And in that aging, others stepped in, helped quietly. No speeches, just presence. And when those elders finally died, they were remembered not with names, but with places. Here, she found the wild onion. There, he taught me to make the snare. Memory lived in the land. The impossible struggle of early humans was not impossible because of any single threat. It was impossible because it never ended. Every day was a challenge, every night a test, and yet, they endured. They adapted. They found ways to carry forward, not with hope, perhaps, not with vision, but with presence, with persistence, and in that slow, almost silent persistence, something extraordinary began. Humanity, quiet, fragile, resilient, real. There was no calendar to mark the passage of years, no names for decades, no measurement of time beyond the slow rhythm of sunrise and sunset, the changing air of the seasons, the growth and decay of plants. Yet time passed unmistakably. Children became adults, adults became elders, elders passed away, and others took their place. The cycle was slow and unmarked, but unbroken. Somewhere deep within the patterns of survival, humans began to look back. They remembered places and events not because they were useful, but because they mattered. A dry riverbed that had once flowed. Strong, a cave that had once sheltered the entire group from a great storm. A hill where someone had once stood and seen fire in the distance. These memories carried no benefit, but they stayed. Remembering, it seemed, was part of what it meant to be human. They began to leave signs, a scratched mark on a rock, a pile of stones carefully arranged, a stick driven into the ground, left to lean at an angle. These things had no immediate use, but they had meaning, however quiet, however simple. They were markers, not of ownership, but of memory. We were here. This happened. This place matters. The land spoke to them in its own language. The sound of birds going silent, the way the grass bent before rain, the scent of animals on the move. These were not metaphors to them, they were lessons. They listened not with ears alone, but with their whole bodies. They moved through the world not above it, not in command of it, but as part of it. Nature did not serve them. They tried to live beside it. In some places, food became slightly more reliable. A river rich with fish, a grove heavy with fruit. And for the first time, some families lingered longer. They returned more frequently. They began to shape the land, gently scattering seeds, not knowing they were planting, digging small ditches, not knowing they were irrigating. Their hands, always busy, began to influence more than their immediate needs. It would be a long time before they truly domesticated any plants or animals. But the very beginnings, the faintest hints were there, a sense that they could not only take from the world, but guide it. It wasn't planned, it wasn't understood, but slowly, the wild became familiar, and the familiar began to change. They still moved when they had to, when storms came, or animals failed to return, or rivers dried up. But each return to a familiar place added a layer of understanding. They knew where the soil was soft, where the animals crossed, where the danger slept. And with that knowledge came confidence, not certainty, but comfort. More sounds entered their shared language, still without structure, but rich with meaning. A tone of warning, a signal to come, a sound for water, for hunger, for pain. Simple words, if they could be called words at all, began to form, passed from mother to child, hunter to hunter, elder to group. These sounds, small and breathy, were tools just as surely as stones and spears had been. They shaped not only objects, but relationships, and relationships deepened. People cared not only for survival, but for one another. When one was injured, others stayed close. When one was sick, others shared food. These small acts were not done for reward. They were part of the fabric that held them together. They knew, without thinking, that they needed one another, not just for protection or work, but for something quieter, a sense of belonging. At night, beside the fire, they continued to share moments. The story of a hunt, the memory of a long journey, the quiet imitation of an animal's cry. These were not myths, not yet, but they were stories, and stories gave shape to life. They organized the past, they entertained the present, and they offered the faintest glimpse of something lasting. Their minds continued to grow, not in size, but in connection. New thoughts emerged. What if? What next? Why? They didn't ask these questions aloud, but the thoughts flickered at the edges of consciousness. They wondered, not often, not always, but enough to begin changing the shape of the human experience. When a storm came, they no longer only sought shelter. They looked at the way the trees bent, they watched where the water flowed. They saw the birds rise before the wind. They didn't know it, but they were observing patterns, and each pattern, remembered, became another thread in the growing web of knowledge that would someday become science. There were moments of peace, a day when food was plentiful and the air warm, a night when no sounds interrupted their rest, a stretch of days with no travel, no sickness, no fear. In those moments, they simply were. They sat, they watched, they felt the sun. They played simple games with rocks, sticks, shadows. Laughter echoed, soft and fleeting, but hardship was never far. An injury from a fall, a predator that couldn't be scared off, a fire that swept through grasslands. There was always something, always a reason to be alert, always a reason to adapt, and yet they kept going, not through strength alone, but through shared struggle, through learning, through slow, patient endurance. They did not pray, not in the way later humans would, but they felt awe. At the stars, at the storm, at the sudden, overwhelming silence of snow falling on the world. This all lived deep in them, not expressed, but felt. And in that feeling, something spiritual began, not in religion, not in worship, but in connection, a quiet bond with the world. Some of them painted, fingers dipped in mud or ash or crushed berry, marks placed on stone, shapes, lines, not realistic, not symbolic, just marks. But those marks stayed. They didn't fade with memory. They outlasted the person who made them, and those who saw them later remembered. This was made. Someone was here. It was not art, it was presence. They lived close to death, and so they respected life. They knew its fragility, its limits, and because of this, they appreciated its small comforts: a warm place to sleep, a shared meal, a dry fire, a quiet morning. These things mattered more than anything else. They did not search for happiness, they searched for continuity. The impossible struggle was not dramatic. It was quiet. It was the everyday effort of staying alive in a world that did not care whether they did or not. There were no heroes, no victories, just persistence, just time. And somehow, against all odds, that was enough. In the stillness of morning, when the mist settled over the trees and the damp air clung softly to skin and hair, early humans began their daily motions once more. Nothing was written, nothing scheduled, but they moved anyway. Hunger stirred. Before thought, the body knew what came next. Hands reached for old tools. Eyes scanned familiar paths. Life resumed, not because of a plan, but because it had to. Their world was not entirely understood, yet it was intimate. They knew each bend in the trail, each ridge on a favorite rock. They knew how a branch would feel before they touched it. They knew the difference between the sound of wind in dry grass and the cautious footsteps of an animal nearby. The unknown was constant, yet the familiar wove through it, grounding them. The children watched everything. They watched how berries were picked, how bones were cracked for marrow, how spears were held and thrown. No school, no lessons, just attention. They learned by seeing, by copying, by failing and trying again. Adults did not explain, they demonstrated. And slowly, over months and years, knowledge settled into small bodies and sharp minds. Some tools were carried far, kept for years, even handed down. Others were used once and left behind. But each one spoke of the same story: effort, a stone shaped to fit the hand, a stick stripped of bark, a shell pierced with care. None of these objects were magical, yet all of them were meaningful. They represented survival, not grand, but necessary. Occasionally, a group member would grow silent, not because of fear or illness, but something else: a distance behind the eyes, a quiet that lasted longer than usual. Perhaps they were remembering someone who had died. Perhaps they were dreaming while awake. There were no words for grief, but the others understood. They gave space. They stayed close. Grief was not spoken, it was shared. The fire remained central. It gave warmth, of course, but also consistency. It was a place to return to. It created a circle in the darkness, a boundary between them and the vast unknown night. Around the fire, they didn't just warm their hands, they found one another. They whispered. They pointed at shadows. They stared at the flames, thinking thoughts no one could hear. Sometimes someone would mimic a sound from the forest: a bird, a cat, a howl. The others would laugh or listen. These mimics were not jokes, they were experiments. A way to make sense of what lived outside their world. A way to bring the wildness closer, to make it less frightening, or perhaps more familiar. Some tried to shape things from clay, pressing wet earth into simple forms. Not yet bowls, not yet figures, but shapes. The earth held fingerprints. These early crafts might not have lasted, but they marked an instinct to touch the world and leave something behind. They still moved often, over mountains, across rivers, through forests. They followed animals. They followed the wind. They followed survival. Every journey was filled with risk and known terrain, predators, exposure, but they went anyway, not for curiosity, but for necessity. And in those long walks, they discovered new plants, new animals, new dangers. They discovered more of the world. Their eyes began to recognize differences between distant groups. A style of tool slightly different, a cut in the hair, a painted line on the skin. These differences sparked both caution and curiosity. Sometimes they backed away. Other times they reached out. And when they did, ideas flowed. They learned. They absorbed. They changed, little by little. Occasionally, they found bones, not just of animals but of others like themselves. Skulls, ribs, jawbones worn smooth by time. Some they ignored, others they touched carefully, arranging them, placing stones around them. Not burial as we know it, but a gesture, a sign that even death was something to witness and remember. Their hands remained busy. A strip of hide stretched and scraped. A leaf folded and tied. A tooth worn into a pendant. They made what they needed, and then more. Not decoration, not yet, but something approaching it. A wish to carry beauty alongside usefulness. Perhaps they felt better when they wore it. Perhaps it meant nothing, but they kept making. As the days warmed and cooled, they began to mark seasons not with names but with signs. The river is high, the grass is dry, the birds have left. These signals told them what to do, when to stay, when to move, when to gather, and when to wait. Nature, not clocks, set the tempo of their lives. Some nights they heard sounds they could not explain, echoes in the dark, stones falling when no one had touched them, cries that did not match any animal they knew. They didn't investigate, listened. Fear was not weakness, it was caution, and it kept them alive. Over time, they began to notice patterns in the stars. Certain clusters returned again and again. A bright light moved differently than the others. The moon changed shape. They had no science, no astrology, but they noticed, and noticing led to wondering. Wondering led to imagination, and imagination would one day become belief. But for now, imagination lived quietly in the stories they told, with gestures and glances, in the way they pointed at shadows and smiled. A face in the bark of a tree, a meaning in the flight of a bird. Not superstition, not yet, just awareness, just awe. The impossible struggle was never won. There was no endpoint, no resting place. But in each generation, life became a little more bearable, a little more known, a little less impossible. They were still cold sometimes, still hungry, still afraid, but they had each other. They had memory, they had fire, they had hands, they had eyes, they had persistence. And against all odds, that was still enough. The days passed, not as chapters in a book, but as quiet repetitions. Breath, step, reach, watch. Nothing grand marked their ending. Nothing monumental signaled a change. And yet, with each silent day, something moved forward. Not quickly, not deliberately, but persistently. Time was not measured, but it accumulated. And with it, so did experience. They began to leave behind more than footprints, more than bones or tools. They left impressions, shaped places in the earth where fires had burned, stones arranged with intention, shelters crafted with care. These traces would someday be found by others, millennia later, who would name the ages and assign meanings. But for the early humans, there was no concept of legacy, only the need to make something that worked, something that lasted, something that helped. The group grew more than physically. They had been surviving for so long that they now began to live slightly beyond the moment. Not entirely, but enough to plan, to store, to wait. The simplest beginnings of foresight had taken root. A dried hide kept for a season, a piece of food buried under cool rocks, a trail marked with a notch on a tree. Their stories were still shared by gesture, expression, and tone, but the urge to communicate more grew. Some sounds began to take on shared meanings, not just for things, but for actions. Come, wait, hurt, go. The spoken breath became a thread that tied minds together. Primitive language took its first real steps, not with grammar, but with purpose. One child watched as an elder smoothed a rock with another stone, eyes wide. The child picked up their own stone and tried. It wasn't useful yet, but the act itself, the mimicry, the desire was a kind of learning that carried across generations. In this way, knowledge was preserved, not in books, not in symbols, but in the hands and eyes of the living. They began to sit longer near the fire, not just for warmth but for togetherness. Sometimes they said nothing. Sometimes they made small sounds, humming or clicking or tapping sticks. These simple rituals, done not out of necessity, but because they brought comfort, were the earliest signs of culture, the beginnings of a shared identity. They didn't know what they were building. They didn't know they were at the start of anything. They only knew the next need, the next shelter, the next hunger, the next danger. But every small decision to stay close, to share food, to protect the sick carried something greater than survival. It carried continuity. Across distant lands, other groups, unknown, unseen, were doing the same. Different tools, different ways, but the same pattern. live, adapt. Remember, their paths never crossed, but they were linked by the same quiet struggle. All of them walking the thin edge between existence and extinction. The world around them shifted slowly. Animals came and went. Ice crept across continents and receded again. Forests changed to grasslands. Grasslands to deserts. They adapted again and again, not as masters of the land, but as its quiet observers. They never ruled it, they moved with it. One evening, under a sky scattered with stars, an elder sat alone at the edge of the sleeping group. They looked up not for answers, not even with questions, but with wonder. The stars offered no warmth, no food, no tools. But still they were beautiful. And for a moment, that was enough. Beauty, too, was part of being human. And so the story goes not as a legend, not as a tale of conquest, but as a long and steady walk. The impossible struggle was never solved. It was endured. Every generation stood on the edge of risk, and still they chose to continue. Not because they believed in a future, but because they had made it through another day. Eventually someone would carve lines into stone. Someone would bury the dead with care. Someone would plant and wait. Someone would build a place to stay. Civilization would rise, slowly and uncertainly. But none of that could have happened without those first people, without their quiet determination, their uncelebrated endurance, their long sleep beside fire and fear. They were not forgotten, even if no one knew their names. Every step we take, every word we speak, every thought we share, is built upon the path they made. A path worn not by glory, but by repetition. And so we remember them not with monuments, not with ceremony, but with silence. With the stillness that matches theirs. With the breath that echoes theirs. With the long, slow rhythm of time continuing. May close your eyes now, if they are not already closed. The fire is low, but safe. The world outside is vast, but you are warm, and still, and here. The impossible struggle has become a quiet memory. Rest now, just as they once did, under stars that remain unchanged.